Dubai is beautiful. Dubai is one of the most beautiful cities I have seen, with all its beautiful architecture, landscape, and every other thing.
Every year, millions of people pack their bags and fly to Dubai, chasing sunshine, luxury, and the kind of holiday that fills your camera roll for months. But something has quietly changed. The workers on the ground, the ones who see everything and get seen by nobody, are starting to talk because the tourists are disappearing and nobody is giving a straight answer about why. So what is really going on inside the world's most glamorous city? And why are the people who built it with their own hands the last ones anyone is asking? Join us as we reveal the truth nobody wants us to find. The dream that took over the world. A long time ago, Dubai was just a small fishing village sitting quietly on the edge of the desert. There were no skyscrapers, no luxury hotels, no famous skyline, just sand, sea, and a small community that most people outside the region had never even heard of. It was the kind of place that did not appear on anyone's travel list, and nobody was rushing to move there. Then everything changed, and it changed faster than almost anyone could have predicted. The leaders of Dubai made a decision early on that was bold and risky in equal measure. They looked at what they had and decided it was not enough. Oil money had given them a foundation, but they knew that foundation would not last forever. So they made a choice that would define the city for generations. They decided to build something the world had never seen before, and they were going to make sure the whole world was watching when they did it. They built the tallest building on Earth. They created islands shaped like palm trees in the middle of the sea. They put an indoor ski slope inside a shopping mall sitting in the middle of a desert. Every single project was designed with one goal in mind: to make people stop, stare, and talk. And it worked better than even the most optimistic planner had dared to hope. Tourism numbers told the story clearly. In the early 2000s, around 7 million visitors were arriving every year. But by the early 2020s, that figure had climbed past 16 million. Dubai had placed itself perfectly between Europe, Asia, and Africa. The airport expanded to match the ambition and became one of the busiest aviation hubs on Earth. Billionaires relocated there. Celebrities posted from its rooftops. Tech founders and investors arrived with money to spend. And suddenly, Dubai was not just a destination. It was a statement. The city also built something less visible but equally powerful: a reputation for political neutrality in a world constantly splitting into opposing sides. Dubai presented itself as a place where everyone was welcome. Business deals happened there between people who would never have sat in the same room anywhere else. And the city positioned itself as a global meeting point that operated above the noise of world politics. But building a city on spectacle always comes with a cost that does not show up immediately. When a place grows that fast, the foundations rarely receive the same care as the dazzling surface sitting on top of them. Dubai had spent decades perfecting what the world could see. What it had never fully prepared for was the moment people started looking more carefully at everything underneath. And in 2024, the cracks finally began to show. The slow decline begins. The decline arrived the way most serious problems do, quietly and gradually, through a long series of small signs that were easy to miss. And in a city as good at projecting confidence as Dubai, most people were not paying close attention at all. The hotels felt it first. For years, Dubai's hotels had operated at occupancy levels that other cities could only dream about. Rooms filled weeks in advance. Premium suites commanded extraordinary prices and still sold without difficulty. Then, slowly and without fanfare, the bookings began softening. Rooms that had previously filled without effort began sitting empty midweek. Rates that had never needed discounting were suddenly being discounted, and managers who had spent years turning guests away were now chasing customers for the first time in their careers. The airlines noticed it too. Dubai's airport had always been a place of controlled chaos, a symbol of the city's relentless energy. But by 2024, passenger volumes on several key routes had quietly dropped. Some carriers began trimming flight frequencies, others shelved expansion plans they had been confident about just 12 months earlier. None of it made big news because each individual decision seemed small, but together they were all pointing in the same direction. Retail felt the pressure too. Foot traffic in Dubai's enormous malls began declining. Luxury brands that had once competed fiercely for the best floor space began quietly reassessing their local operations, and the energy inside those vast spaces started feeling noticeably thinner than it once had. What made this period particularly confusing was that Dubai's official messaging stayed relentlessly positive throughout. Records were still being claimed, and government announcements continued projecting confidence. But the people working at ground level were living a completely different reality. Part of what made the problem so difficult to address was structural. Dubai had built enormous capacity across every sector, assuming continuous growth. The moment demand softened even slightly, the oversized infrastructure made the gap painfully visible. Empty hotel corridors, quiet mall concourses, and half-full flights all told the same story at the same time. A city that had always moved forward with total confidence was quietly entering territory it had never experienced before. And the numbers alone were never going to force the world to pay attention to what was really happening. That was going to take something far more dramatic, far more visible, and far more impossible to ignore. The flood that exposed everything. Dubai City had been engineered for an entirely different kind of climate. Its roads, its drainage systems, and its entire urban design had been built around one assumption that had always held true, that serious rainfall was something Dubai simply did not experience. The city had spent billions on towers and temperature-controlled everything but almost nothing on flood management. There had never been a reason to, until suddenly there was. On the 16th of April 2024, the heaviest rainfall the UAE had recorded in over 75 years arrived without warning.
This is the Arabian Desert, specifically the United Arab Emirates, which is right now drying out from historic rainfall. This comes after deadly storms hit it earlier this week.
In some areas, a full year's worth of rain fell in less than 24 hours. Streets turned into fast-moving rivers. Underpasses filled so rapidly that cars were completely swallowed, and residential areas that had never seen a flood in their entire existence were suddenly underwater before residents had time to react. The international airport effectively shut down. Flights were canceled in enormous numbers. Passengers who had just landed found themselves stranded inside a terminal that was flooding around them. Videos spread everywhere.
The water had come over the top of cars, flooded the airport there, the runways, some of the images of planes landing there. They had to close down the airport, one of the busiest airports in the world.
Showing luggage floating through corridors and water pouring through the ceiling. These were not images from a city with aging infrastructure. These were images from a place that had spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars telling the world it was the future. And the contrast was devastating. Outside the airport, luxury cars sat abandoned in floodwater on highways that had been perfectly fine that same morning. Apartment lobbies were submerged, parking levels flooded completely, and emergency services were stretched far beyond anything they had been designed to handle. What made the flood so significant was not just the destruction, it was the conversation it refused to stop. In a single day, one storm had ripped open the gap between Dubai's polished image and the fragile reality hiding underneath. A city that had marketed itself as world-class and future-ready had been stopped completely by rain, and the whole world had watched it happen in real time. International criticism was immediate. News outlets ran the viral images everywhere. Commentators questioned how a city sitting on enormous financial resources had invested so little in something as basic as drainage. The government pointed to the unprecedented scale of the rainfall, and that was a fair point. But the conversation had already moved somewhere that a press statement could not reach. For years, Dubai had managed its reputation with extraordinary skill. Negative stories rarely stuck, but the flood gave the world a framework for questioning Dubai that had not existed before, and once that framework was in place, people began applying it to everything else they looked at. The flood did not create Dubai's problems, but it tore away the surface and forced the world to look at what had been quietly building underneath for years. And what was underneath was far more serious than dirty floodwater. The hidden problem surface. The flood was gone within days. The water dried up, the airport reopened, the highways cleared, and Dubai went back to looking exactly the way it always had, clean, polished, and perfectly put together. But something had changed that could not simply be cleaned up or dried out, because for the first time in a long time, the world was asking questions about Dubai that it had never really asked before. For years, Dubai had managed its image with incredible skill. Bad stories rarely gained traction. Criticism was quickly buried under the next big announcement. A new tower, a new record, a new event that reminded everyone why the city was special. The machine that kept Dubai's reputation shining had always been powerful enough to drown out the noise, but the flood had been too big, too viral, and too visible for that machine to handle. People started looking more carefully, and what they found was not reassuring. Journalists and researchers who had been quietly tracking Dubai's growth for years began publishing findings that had previously struggled to find a wide audience. The gap between what Dubai projected and what was actually happening inside the city was wider than most outsiders had realized. The property market told one part of the story. Dubai had experienced a massive construction boom over the previous decade. Thousands of new apartments, hotels, and commercial buildings had been added to a city that was already enormous. Developers kept building because prices kept rising and demand seemed endless. But by 2024, a growing number of those properties were sitting empty. Vacancy rates in certain districts had climbed significantly, and rental yields that investors had been counting on were starting to disappoint. The business environment told another part. Dubai had positioned itself as one of the easiest places in the world to start a company, and for a while, that reputation was completely deserved. But over time, the cost of doing business had quietly crept upward. Licensing fees, operational costs, and the sheer expense of maintaining a lifestyle in the city had made it harder for small and medium businesses to survive. Several business owners who had relocated to Dubai during the post-pandemic boom began quietly winding down their operations and looking elsewhere. The social picture was complicated too. Dubai had always been a city of layers. An ultra-wealthy surface sitting on top of a much larger population of workers and middle-income expats who kept the whole operation running. The flood had briefly made those layers visible in an uncomfortable way. Images of flooded workers' accommodations sitting alongside images of flooded luxury villas told a story about inequality that Dubai's carefully managed image had always kept out of the frame. The perfect city myth had not collapsed overnight, but it had cracked in a way that could not be ignored. Beneath all of those cracks, one problem was hitting people harder than anything else, because it was affecting absolutely everyone who called Dubai home. The cost crisis. For a long time, one of Dubai's most powerful selling points was simple. Yes, it was glamorous. Yes, it was exciting. But compared to cities like London, New York, or Singapore, it was also genuinely affordable. Expats who moved there often found they could live significantly better lives for the same or even less money. Affordability was a huge part of why so many people chose Dubai over every other option available to them. Starting around 2022 and accelerating sharply through 2023 and 24, the cost of living in Dubai began rising at a pace that caught most residents completely off guard. Rents led the way. In many popular residential areas, rent increases of 40% or more were recorded over a relatively short period. A two-bedroom apartment that had rented for a comfortable price just a couple of years earlier was suddenly commanding figures that felt completely out of reach for the same people who had been happily living there before. It was not just rent. Groceries climbed, school fees climbed, utility bills climbed, the cost of eating out climbed, and the everyday expenses that made up the fabric of normal life in the city all moved in the same direction at roughly the same time. Suddenly, Dubai was not just competing with London and New York on glamour. It was competing with them on price too. And for most ordinary expats, that completely changed the maths. The reaction was predictable. People left, not loudly, not in dramatic waves that made headlines, but quietly and steadily. Professionals who had spent years building their lives in Dubai began doing the calculations and deciding that the numbers no longer added up. The businesses that relied on those middle-income expats began feeling the pressure almost immediately. Restaurants lost their regular customers, retail spending softened, and the kind of steady, everyday economic activity that keeps a city functioning at ground level started to thin out in ways that were hard to ignore if you were actually living and working there. The wealthy were largely unaffected. Dubai's top tier continued to function exactly as it always had. The ultra-luxury segment of the market remained strong, and the city continued to attract ultra-high net worth individuals looking for a tax-friendly base. But that top tier could not carry the entire economy on its own. And the middle layer that had always done the quiet, heavy lifting was visibly shrinking. A city losing its affordable edge loses something far more important than just a price advantage. But the cost crisis was only one reason people were leaving, because at the same time Dubai was becoming harder to afford. The tourists who had always kept it buzzing were quietly choosing somewhere else entirely. Tourists are choosing elsewhere. Tourism had always been the heartbeat of Dubai's economy. It was the thing that kept the hotels full, the restaurants busy, the taxis moving, and the malls packed. For 2 decades, the city had grown its visitor numbers almost every single year, pulling in travelers from every corner of the world with a combination of spectacle, sunshine, and smart marketing. But by 2024, something had shifted in a way that went deeper than a temporary dip. The Russian tourists were among the first major group to disappear. Before the war in Ukraine, Russians had been one of Dubai's single largest visitor demographics. They came in enormous numbers. They spent generously. They bought property, and they filled entire sections of residential buildings in areas like International City and Dubai Marina. When sweeping international sanctions hit Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, that flow of visitors and money was cut dramatically, and the easy movement that had made Dubai such a popular destination for Russian travelers essentially stopped. An entire segment of Dubai's tourism base vanished almost overnight and was never fully replaced. The Indian market told a different kind of story. For years, Indian tourists had been a cornerstone of Dubai's visitor numbers, and the large Indian expat community made it feel familiar and welcoming. But something changed in the way wealthy Indians thought about travel. Luxury experiences inside India itself improved dramatically as new resorts, restaurants, and destinations developed at home. A growing number of affluent Indian travelers began asking themselves why they needed to fly to Dubai. When similar or better experiences were now available without leaving their own country, the outbound travel that Dubai had counted on began softening in ways the city had not anticipated. Western tourists were shifting too. For European and American travelers, the calculation had always been straightforward. Dubai offered guaranteed sunshine, world-class hotels, impressive experiences, and a relatively easy trip. But the rise of Southeast Asia as a premium travel destination had created serious competition. Destinations like Bali, Thailand, Vietnam, and Japan were offering extraordinary experiences at prices that made Dubai look expensive by comparison. And they came with something Dubai genuinely could not match: natural beauty, cultural depth, and environments that felt genuinely different from everyday life back home. The result was a tourism market that was softer, more fragmented, and harder to predict than at any point in Dubai's recent history. The city was still receiving millions of visitors, but the quality of spend, the length of stays, and the loyalty of its core audiences had all weakened at the same time. Dubai had spent 20 years building a global audience, and that audience was quietly drifting away. Losing tourists was only part of the problem, because for the people still living and working in Dubai, the city itself was becoming harder to physically endure, and no amount of air conditioning could fix what was coming. The heat problem. If you have never been to Dubai in the middle of summer, it is very hard to explain what that kind of heat actually feels like. It is not just warm. It is not just uncomfortable. It is the kind of heat that hits you the moment you step outside and makes your body feel like it is being pressed against something burning.
I am actually here in Dubai in August. Obviously, August is usually by far the hottest month that I've spent in the summer heat.
Temperatures regularly climb above 45 degrees Celsius in the peak summer months. And in recent years, readings of 50 degrees and beyond have become less rare and more routine. For a long time, Dubai managed this problem with a simple solution: air conditioning everywhere, all the time, in every building, every mall, every taxi, every hotel lobby. The city essentially built an entirely indoor lifestyle that allowed residents and visitors to move through their days without ever really having to face the heat directly. Covered walkways, climate-controlled transport, and the sheer density of indoor spaces made it possible to live in Dubai without spending more than a few minutes outside at a stretch. But that solution is starting to reach its limits. The heat has grown more intense, and the periods of extreme temperature have grown longer. Outdoor workers who have no choice but to spend hours in the sun face conditions that are genuinely dangerous. Construction sites, delivery drivers, and maintenance crews operate in heat that health experts have described as beyond the threshold of what the human body can safely handle. The government introduced midday work bans during the hottest months, but enforcement has been inconsistent, and the underlying problem has not gone away. For tourists, the heat issue has become a genuine deterrent. The traditional selling point of Dubai's sunshine has always been warmth, but there is a significant difference between pleasant warmth and dangerous heat. Travel advisors and tourists who have visited during summer months increasingly describe the experience as oppressive rather than enjoyable. Outdoor attractions that Dubai spent enormous money developing sit largely unused for months at a time, simply because standing outside becomes an ordeal rather than a pleasure. The city also has no natural escape. Other hot cities around the world offer mountains, forests, coastlines with cool breezes, or nearby highland areas where residents can decompress from urban heat. Dubai has none of that. The desert stretches in every direction, and the sea in summer is warm enough to feel like a bath, rather than a relief. There is nowhere to go when the heat becomes too much, except indoors, and even that carries a cost. The energy required to cool an entire city through a 6-month summer is staggering. Electricity demand during peak summer months places enormous pressure on infrastructure, and the environmental footprint of running industrial-scale air conditioning across a major city year after year is a growing concern that sits awkwardly alongside Dubai's stated ambitions around sustainability. A city that cannot be comfortably lived in for half the year faces a question that no amount of marketing can answer cleanly. The heat was not the only thing quietly crushing the people who kept Dubai running, because underneath the skyline, the workforce that built and maintained all of it was carrying a weight that was becoming impossible to ignore. The silent workforce crisis. Dubai could not exist without its migrant workers. That is simply the truth. The towers were built by them. The roads were laid by them. The hotels are cleaned by them. The food is delivered by them. Every single piece of the city's famous infrastructure was constructed and is maintained every single day by a workforce that comes almost entirely from South Asia and Southeast Asia, from countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and the Philippines. Men and women who left their homes and their families behind to earn money in a city that needed their labor to function. For decades, this arrangement existed in a kind of global blind spot. People admired Dubai's skyline without spending much time thinking about the conditions of the people who built it. But over time, and especially after a series of major international investigations and reports, that blind spot became harder to maintain. The working and living conditions of Dubai's migrant labor force began attracting serious and sustained global attention in a way that the city's reputation managers found increasingly difficult to neutralize. The issues that kept appearing in those reports were consistent. Workers arriving in Dubai often found that the job they had been promised was different from the one they actually received. Recruitment fees paid in their home countries left many arriving already in debt, Wages were sometimes delayed or disputed, and accommodation in labor camps was frequently described as overcrowded and inadequate. The kafala system, which tied a worker's legal status directly to their employer, gave companies enormous power over individual workers and made it very difficult for those workers to leave bad situations without risking deportation. The UAE government introduced a series of reforms in the early 2020s that were widely covered and genuinely significant. A minimum wage framework was introduced, some restrictions on worker mobility were loosened, and official channels for reporting abuse were expanded. But human rights organizations and journalists who continued monitoring the situation reported that the gap between the reforms on paper and the reality on the ground remained wide in many areas. The global conversation around ethical travel and ethical business had also shifted significantly. A new generation of tourists, investors, and companies were increasingly asking questions about the human cost behind the destinations and products they chose.
Dubai is in many ways the epicenter of globalization. For decades, it positioned itself as the Middle East's neutral refuge for capital, talent, and tourism.
And Dubai kept appearing near the top of those conversations in ways that created real reputational pressure. Not enough to stop the city functioning, but enough to make certain audiences think twice before booking a flight or signing a business deal. For the workers themselves, the pressure was deeply personal. Thousands of men in particular had borrowed money to come to Dubai, were sending every spare dirham home to families who depended entirely on those remittances, and were living in conditions that bore no resemblance to the gleaming city they were helping to maintain every single day. The people holding Dubai together were carrying more than anyone on the outside could easily see. While all of this was happening inside the city, the ground beneath Dubai's global political position was shifting in ways that threatened to damage something it had spent decades carefully building. The breaking point. For most of its modern history, Dubai had pulled off something genuinely impressive. It had stayed friends with almost everyone, in a world that was constantly dividing itself into opposing sides. Dubai had positioned itself as neutral ground, a place where East and West could meet, where rival powers could do business, where political differences were left at the door, and commerce was the only language that really mattered. That neutrality was not just a philosophy, it was a business strategy. And for a long time, it worked extraordinarily well. But the world changed, and Dubai's carefully balanced position became harder and harder to maintain. The war in Ukraine created immediate pressure. When Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, Dubai found itself in an uncomfortable spotlight because Russian money, Russian businesses, and Russian individuals had been flowing into the city for years. The city was accused by Western governments and journalists of providing a soft landing for sanctioned wealth, of allowing money to move through its financial system in ways that undermined the international pressure campaign against Moscow. Dubai pushed back on those characterizations, but the accusations kept coming, and the reputational damage was real. The conflict in Gaza created a different but equally difficult problem. Dubai sits within a region where the war generated enormous emotion and political pressure. As a global city with Muslim-majority populations forming large parts of both its resident and tourist base, the conflict placed Dubai in a position where any stance it appeared to take carried consequences. Calls for boycotts of businesses connected to countries involved in the conflict spread across social media and affected consumer behavior in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss entirely. Several major events and partnerships attracted protests and negative attention that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The global conversation around tax havens and financial transparency had also been building pressure for years. Dubai's tax-free environment had always been one of its greatest attractions. But as international organizations pushed harder for global minimum tax standards and greater financial transparency, the model that had made Dubai so appealing to wealthy individuals and corporations began attracting more scrutiny and less admiration from the wider world. Everything seemed to be arriving at once. The cost crisis was pushing out the middle class. The tourism base was fragmenting. The heat was shortening the usable year. The workforce conditions were drawing ethical criticism. The political neutrality strategy was cracking under global pressure. And the flood had already shown the world that the city's physical infrastructure was not as bulletproof as its marketing had always suggested. None of this meant Dubai was finished. The city still had enormous wealth, powerful leadership, and a genuine ability to adapt that had already surprised the world more than once. But the version of Dubai that had seemed unstoppable, endlessly growing, and permanently impressive was clearly under more pressure than at any point in its history. A city built on the promise of perfection was discovering what every great empire eventually discovers: that nothing built on image alone can stand forever. And the harder you work to look untouchable, the more it hurts when the cracks finally show. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.